Yep, there we go. Hey, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, collecting all the data and protecting all the things is not as exciting as drinking all the booze and hacking all the things, but someone has to be responsible. And so that falls to the blue team, right? So my name's Aaron Rosenmund. I work for Pluralsight, developing cybersecurity training. Thank you. Yeah, we make courses and do research, and I work solely within incident response and security operations. Part-time, I work for the Florida Air National Guard, where I work in defensive cyber operations, essentially on really small manned SOCs that have to use a lot of automation, which is kind of what has created this brief for me, right? So according to the instructions, you can do the questions at sli.do, and there's the keyword there. And I'm going to have to go a little fast on this brief because it was originally an hour-long brief, and now it's 30 minutes. So if you want to go ahead and download it from GitHub, don't worry, you don't need to take notes, so you should be good. Cool. So we're here to talk about the problems, advanced threats. The easy stuff like the script kiddies and the hacktivists and all that can get caught because we already know what they're going to do. We have signatures developed to catch that, right? But the advanced threats are burning 0 days and using things that we don't understand yet, and we have to develop methods to find that before it's too late. And really too late is just we have to catch it at all because it's likely on all of our networks. We just don't know about it yet. And 146 days, I think, is the current discovery time, right? We need to get that down. And the way to do that is to collect and analyze all of the data. And that sounds like a lot to do, but we're going to talk about how we do that. And once we have all that data and all that analysis, we have to develop some sort of method of workflow management so that we can task our guys in our security operations center to be able to understand that data and make it actionable. So let's set the scene a little bit. This is definitely not a talk about Stuxnet, but Stuxnet is still a really good example for something that did not come over the network, right? It was just some dude who thought he had some Beyonce on a USB, plugged it into a laptop, and then all of a sudden centrifuges start blowing up. I'm pretty sure that's a little simplified, but that's the idea, right? And imagine for a second that you're the guy in charge of security for this. So allegedly, just put allegedly in front of everything I say. Allegedly, this happened 3 times, and the third time it happened, AC/DC's Thunderstruck played over the speakers. So you're a guy in charge of security in a facility like this. You walk in, grab some coffee, go talk to Jeff down on the floor. Then all of a sudden you start hearing some American rock music play over the speakers, and you're like, oh no. And then centrifuges start blowing up left and right, boom, boom, boom. And you're like, oh man, that's really dramatic. And the first thing you think, or at least the first thing I would think, is like, oh, you guys, that was impressive, right? And then the second thing you're going to think is, I'm going to start prepping my resume, and what did I miss? And that's what we're going to talk about here. Okay, so quantum physics for security. What you missed was all the stuff you weren't looking at. So, maybe you paid Palo Alto or Cisco a whole bunch of money and you got your network security set up, and maybe at the second time it happened, you got an IDS going, and you're like, man, I am super good. But it didn't come in that way. You're kind of like a chicken nugget, right? You're crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. And you're not looking at all the other stuff. And unlike quantum physics, what you weren't looking at wasn't undetermined. It was actually the cat was dead. So there's a little quantum physics joke for you. All right. And the stuff you need to be looking at, other than network, is everything else, the application data, the machine data, and the point OS. So you can break this up however you want, but we're going to kind of go over what all this means from my perspective and how you can identify and analyze data here, not just from a signature perspective, but also from the perspective of behavior. So instead of developing tens of thousands of signatures, try to understand a whole bunch of different attacks, you can instead make one behavioral script that's like, hey, if this looks bad, then it probably is bad, and I can use less CPU cycles to identify that. Cool. But we're going to start with the network, because that's probably where every one of you has started. And if you have any security at all, it started at the network. You're that chicken nugget. Hopefully you can move some inspection of the network internally. So you're looking over your core, over your servers. If you're in the cloud, you're inspecting traffic that's happening internal to your cloud environment. And if you have not done that, here's some open source stuff you can use to start doing it. The first thing you do is collect the data, right? And you can do that with things like NetStiffNG, Google Stenographer, and use pfRing to kind of manage some of that memory. And the analysis for open source projects really falls into 2 categories that are leading here, and it's Snort and it's Fork Suricata. And the main difference is multi-threading. So Snort's really the most popular one, and there's a cool little project called Squeal that helps you visualize that. And here's what that looks like. And that's really cool. We have signatures. These signatures have rules that look at the hex data coming inside of a packet, and they want to match this very specific pattern, right? So this is the updated Snort rule set that you can get with a Snort code, and there's a few scans going on here. So just to set the frame within this time frame, we had some nmap scans going, and nmap scans were scanning from 0 to 65,535, so a total of 65,000-ish ports were hit, but only detected were like 5, right? And that's kind of the standard here. And that was a TCP scan. But also what was happening was a UDP scan and a PowerShell internal scan. None of that was caught whatsoever. And the reason is because that rule, if you look at it, is saying that if there are 5 SYN flags within a minute to a very specific port, then I want you to alert on that. But everything else got missed, right? Now, what you also have is it did detect that it was Nmap, and that seems really cool. Like, oh man, Snort figured out that Nmap was scanning me, until you actually look at how it did it. And what it did was say, hey, if you see some of the capital letter C, look deeper in that packet and see if there's a whole bunch more of the capital letter C. And if there are, then that's probably an Nmap scan. And that's really cool until you just like change the letter C to something else and it doesn't see anything at all, right? Or you use mass scan or AMAP or use Scapy and do whatever you want. That will bypass all of this. And if I'm a smart attacker, which hopefully that's what we're concerned about, are these smart attackers, I'm going to run my attacks against this signature database and make sure it doesn't pop up. So the next step is to move into behavioral analysis. Behavioral analysis starts with the sessions. To do session analysis, there's a couple options. NetFlow v9 is kind of the standard. It is Cisco proprietary. You can get that from your switches if you have a license and you have something to actually ingest it, but you don't have to. You can also use something like Bro. It's now called Zeek, but I don't like change, so I'm leaving it that way. Or you can use Moloch, and that helps you take those sessions and visualize it, because that's what us humans are really good at. We're good at analyzing patterns visually, right? So within Bro and within these sessions, what we're really concerned about is looking at the IP5 tuple, right? So it's the source and destination port and IP, as well as the protocol. Bro does this as a scripting language, takes that, turns it into a programmable object, and allows you to create scripts that analyze the behavior of the different attributes of that object. So let's look at that same data set with the scans and see what we can identify. So now we're looking at connection attempts as an object and not just to any specific port, just in general, kind of internally to our environment. And what we're doing is kind of the same thing, is saying if there's any connection attempts at all that are failed, right? So this is a TCP timeout where a reset was sent, because that's not normal application behavior. That's weird. Application that works inside your environment shouldn't be failing, right? So that's what you're looking for here. And sure enough, we found them. And so that 10.102.4.3 is actually the PowerShell internal scanning, which I haven't found anything that will actually detect that. So I use that a lot in the red team. So now let's look at what we're good at. With our humans, big brains, we can look at visual data, identify patterns. So Moloch is looking at some session data here, and it doesn't look that exciting, but that's because we're looking at sessions over time. Let's now change that visual data and take a look at the number of packets. So we have red going out, blue coming in. It's kind of cool, but there's nothing that really pops out of you. It's very consistent still. If we next look at the amount of data bytes going in and out, then we see something a little bit more concerning, right? So over time, data bytes going out are pretty low, data bytes coming in are high, and that's kind of normal. But you can quickly identify with your human eye that there's something weird going on there, and that is actually identified HTTPS exfiltration. So without having to do offloading, we can use our big brains and identify some exfiltration that's encrypted and not be concerned that we're missing stuff that we're not unencrypting. Cool. So here's another little capability. I referenced the ELK Stack a lot, and we'll go over that a little bit more later. This cool capability is called Graph. It uses graph methodology to look at records, and this is kind of the same session data from a instant response that was done. And this session data has connections that were interesting, right? So we're going through and we're finding IPs that we think might be related to an intrusion, and we kind of put that IP into the data set here and ask it to look for stuff that's related. We kind of had an idea there was some different agents doing the HTTPS exfiltration as well as the DNS command and control, and then sure enough, this kind of pops up and validates that those IPs were connected and we're kind of really on the right track. So it's just a cool capability to understand there. Cool. So the next step is machine data. So we got past the network. Now we're going to actually look at those devices that are on our network and what they're doing locally. What I'm talking about is Windows systems and Linux systems. And those local logs like security logs, auth log, syslog, Cisco endpoints, SNMP traps, anything you can get. Your hypervisor also has logs. You need to be importing that as well. It's important. Right, and you're looking for user activity that's local, odd errors, service failures that can indicate, some sort of anomaly that you can correlate with something else, and just strange hardware activity. And this is actually where we can get into some supply chain interdiction detection capability. Right, so the first thing is looking at the auth log for Linux. So this was a web server, and this is SSH logging, right? So people are logging in using different usernames. The first thing you recognize is that there's a really high instance of failed logins. And that's interesting, but without even understanding the frequency of that, you can just look at who's logging in. Are you allowing root to log in as SSH? You shouldn't be, but if you are, then fine. But you're also, do you have a whole bunch of usernames that are very similar to each other? Probably not, right? So some of those usernames, if someone logs in the username that actually is not on the box, then that's weird. You need to kind of interrogate that. So, and then further past this, if that brute force happened, you can look and see if what happened on the box. So were there any new usernames? In this case, there was around the same time period. So now you have a little bit more clue to figure out that maybe that brute force was successful, and now we've made a new username. And if you look at the history, I'm sure you'll see that it was added to the pseudo group, and that intrusion was successful. You can do the same thing with Windows security logs and import those. And what we've done next is import the domain security logs from an environment, right? And when you look at that, we can do things like enable the auditing for success and failures for SMB logins on the domain. So let's do like a share drive or something like that. And the first thing you recognize is that it's kind of weird. There's an increase in volume of just logon activity in general. And that's great. And we're kind of recognizing that with our human brains again here. But what's really weird is when you look at success versus failures of logins, it's not weird that someone logged in wrong, right? Because I do that all the time. What's weird is when the ratio of logins to, or successful logins to failed logins is different than it would be over time normally. And you can do that by looking at large data sets of users logging in over time, and then we see that spike. So that blue is a very high increase in the number of failed logins. And that's bad. Yeah, so that's cool that we did it with our human brains. We're really good at pattern analysis, but what we need to do is figure out how the computer can do that for us and then alert us on it. And here in Kibana, we have a machine learning capability that actually is paid, but you can use Apache Spark to do kind of the same thing, right? AI agrees that spike is bad. That's pretty much what it's doing here. And it's not really AI, it's machine learning. It's still not even really machine learning. It's more like statistical regression analysis. So it's just saying over time, your standard deviation of what normally happens with logins is different, right? But now you can drill down a little bit and do something called population analysis. And when that population is here is the users. And you can say, hey, within this population, which user is acting weird compared to the other users? And here it caught Steve Rogers logging in, which is weird for a whole bunch of reasons. And the main reason is that a 100-year-old man is using THC Hydra, right? Cool. So the next step is we can use that same graph capability. And I think this is cool here because normally, it's not really exciting to see someone use a graph capability with those connections in the nodes with network traffic. But what is kind of cool is you can start mapping information from the security domain logs, and you can map IPs to domain names, and even better, users to IPs to domain names, right? So we're starting to see these connections kind of in a different way. We're visualizing this data in a way that can make certain things pop out that's interesting. So if you see a user logging into multiple devices or an IP change on a domain controller or a domain name, then that's something that's weird and you can interrogate further. So let's talk about telemetry streams. So all of your machines on your network run electricity, and they have boards, and all those boards have components, and all these components have data that you can analyze. So things like bandwidth use and fan speeds and IOPS and CPU usage, and really voltage behavior is pretty interesting as well. And that's kind of what this looks like. You use metric beats and import this data from Linux or Windows boxes alike, and you get information about the CPU and memory usage and that kind of thing. And when you import that over your entire enterprise, you start to get a picture of what that should look like normally. So here, if you drill down to an individual device, you can see at a certain point that the RAM was at full usage, and at the same time, the PowerShell was the top CPU and memory user, right? So maybe that's something interesting when you look at. But the really exciting part is when we start trying to figure out how to catch something like supply chain interdiction, because that's really hard to do. So here, this is a custom application that I built for a Pluralsight course, so don't make fun of me, I'm not a web developer, but the main point is that from my ESXi, I was able to pull the wattage information over time, right? And that's great, but how do you use that to catch supply chain interdiction? Well, the first step is that you have to have kind of quite a few devices that you're using. So whether that's switches or servers or even endpoints like a Dell desktop, right? And then you need to pull that voltage information. But the first thing you need to do is get it from different distributors. Because what generally happens is a distributor will team up with some factory that will team up with an advanced thread that will then kind of conspire to sell you something that has a compromised motherboard, right? And that compromised motherboard with different components is theoretically going to use electricity differently that will be reflected in the way that that voltage is consumed or that voltage displays. So if you can source that from different distributors and then tag that information as it comes into your ingest and then look for different voltage activity between distributors, you can start to identify anomalies. And that's great. It's still not really identifying supply chain interdiction, but when you map that to odd network behavior, now you're starting to get a lot closer. So near and dear to my heart is endpoint analysis, but really it can be very simple. Right? So some of the things you can do to get started with this is use Sysmon, right? Sysmon's pretty great. It essentially adds an extra log to your Windows boxes that you can pull different usable security information out of. And Swift on Security has a great config for that. You need to config to make it the most usable. And so Taylor Swift in her off time has made that for us. And that's really nice of her to do. So the next thing I have here is PowerShell, and it works on Windows and Linux now, which is great. I love PowerShell, and we'll get into why this is a great tool for security in the next slides, right? OS Query for agent, open source agent capability. You can load OS Query in any box. It turns the OS into a relational database, and you can query those relational databases. What's really cool about it is it works on Macs, Linux, and Windows. And something worth an honorable mention is an NSA tool called Grassmarlin. You can download it. They've made it available on GitHub. And it's mainly used for SCADA, but what it actually does is passively listens to the network and builds an asset list of everything that identifies on that network. Now I bring up asset list under endpoint analysis because the first thing you need to do is understand what assets are actually on your network, right? So talking about PowerShell, we can use this in a bunch of different ways. And the most important part about this is you don't have to be an admin on a box to use PowerShell. So as a user, you can go back to your environment right now, run some scripts and start to do some asset interrogation and start to do some security with PowerShell without having any rights whatsoever on the network. You can do things like file hash analysis, you can pull registry key values, you can do asset identification, you can do scans, and that makes it a really powerful tool, right? There's other tools as well. So I have the DCO there, and inside there's a script called PowerScan. We'll get into that next. But PS Recon and Power Forensics also can pull a whole bunch of usable forensic data from any device in your network. So that PowerScan tool essentially makes network connections or test network connections to a subnet. So if you've done your asset and configuration management properly, the first thing that this does is identify what boxes are responding on that network. So if something's responding that is on your asset list, that's an easy kill, right? The next thing it does is we can identify here that there's a TTL difference within that subnet. So that subnet is supposed to be mainly a Windows subnet, and now we have a 64 TTL. What does that mean? It means it's likely a Linux box, right? So someone actually live boot Kali here, and we found some insider thread. This is a real network. I was actually just testing this to see if it would work, and then sure enough, we found this, right? The next thing you do is look for kind of different configurations just on basic ports. And here, out of all the boxes that responded, it's got a 128 TTL, but HTTP is open, which is kind of odd. So that's a strange configuration. Now, I bring up OS Query. I was trying to just do like one example per section. But I bring up OS Query again here because it's agent-based, right? And if we're pulling data from that OS, it can lie to us. So if that OS is saying that it's not listening on a port, and then we scan it with the previous script and it is listening on a port, that likely means that there's a rootkit on there that's making the OS lie to us. And that's also an interesting metric we can use to identify a security anomaly. Great. So application data, what is that? That is actually everything else. So everything that we use to actually operate on the internet is included in application logs and data, right? So I include DNS and DHCP in there, but it's also Apache and SharePoint, any web stuff that you use. So those logs that come from those are separate from the logs that we normally get from machine data. And the same idea is going to apply. We're going to parse them with Logstash, we're going to throw them into Elastic, and then we're going to visualize them with Kibana. Now, let's focus on DNS. If you look at your DNS entries and you see this, right, there's some weird strings there. And we can identify that because we understand that those aren't normal words. And those shouldn't be domain names that are being queried. But how do you make a machine do that? Well, you can use entropy calculation to calculate the randomness of those strings and make a value out of that. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to immediately give you good information. You're going to have to baseline your environment. But what you can do is once you baseline your environment for a number, say 4.3, you can say, well, anything 10% higher than that's probably something very random for our environment and very well could be command and control. And when you do that, you can get an alert that gives you only the DNS command and control that you're looking for. So this is a quick way to kind of evaluate whether a DNS query is good or bad. So the next thing we're looking at is protocol metadata. That includes quite a few things. One of the notable entries here is GeoIP, right? Like a user can't be in one location and simultaneously logged in from another location on the globe. But what I want to focus on is the JA3 hashes, right? So these JA3 hashes are going to look at encrypted traffic. And when we look at encrypted traffic, we can't see into it, but what we can see is the initial TLS handshake. When that handshake occurs, cipher suites are exchanged, and those are unique to the executables that are creating that connection. So the cipher suites are then turned into a hash, and that's what this J3 cert is, right? So J3 here looks like a lot of unusable data, but when we look at that over 3 hours of 16 users office activity, we can see that there's not really a lot of hashes created, right? And that's using a bunch of different applications. Even better, 3 of those were only used one time. So this makes us really able to do a whitelist scenario where maybe 20 applications are used in your entire environment, and if anything else shows up that shouldn't be there, that's a whitelist violation. Cool. So when you put it all together, that seems like a whole lot of stuff to look at. But really the idea here is that we're going to take those alerts, and those alerts from all those new capabilities that we've just talked about are the new logs, right? We're going to take those logs and look for correlations across those, and then only interrogate stuff that matches multiple types of alerts. And you've probably seen a pattern here, right? And the pattern is we take a whole bunch of data, we put it in a database backend, and then we display it with Kibana or something like that. And I'm not the only one who thinks that's a good idea. Every single one of these projects does the exact same thing, right? And all of these are security-related projects. I'm going to focus on the Hive project because that's our workflow management system that can tie all this stuff together. And when we do that, we can use the REST API to take all of those custom alerts and put them into the Hive database. The Hive will then look for observables that match from different types of alerts, right? So every single one of these was associated with the same IP, and then it's going to alert you to that. And so now you can assign your limited personnel to only look at things that show up in multiple alerts. And then you can task them accordingly, right? So that you're making the best use of your people. And you can look at those alerts by status. And you can also look at the types of observables that are there to see if there's some sort of larger pattern. And from a management perspective, you can have them open cases and see how many cases you're opening and closing over time. The next thing you really have to worry about is intelligence and how you include that. So the Hive uses something called Cortex to integrate with MISP, and there's 30 different threat intelligence sources it can use to kind of enrich the data that's found in those observables and see if they match any other databases for something that's malicious. So I give you a whole bunch of stuff that you can do to fill gaps that you may have in your collection analysis. But I didn't tell you how to do any of it, and that's because I think you can read. And I'm working on a project called Protoss with some others. And what this does is take every single one of those open source capabilities and gives you a step-by-step on how to tie them together, configs you need to put on your switches so you can do proper spans, and how you can scale that from a laptop-sized capability that does all those things to a enterprise capability that scales out to as much data analysis as you need. And that's it. Questions? I don't know how the question thing works. Yeah. Yeah, is there any questions on the SLA do thing? Oh, okay. Yeah, hold on. Let me see you. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So So my perspective on that is the alerts aren't what I'm prosecuting anymore. I'm only prosecuting things that are alerts from multiple types of domains, right? So if you looked at the example in the Hive project, right, if the J3 cert whitelist popped, hey, there's something that's violating the whitelist, I don't have anybody look at that, right? But if it's violating the whitelist and my machine learning analysis is saying that there's an odd HTTPS exfiltration and there's a snort alert on it, and right, so now I went from like 60%, like maybe that's something bad, to like 95%, that's definitely something bad, right? And so instead of trying to worry about tuning every single tool I have in my environment, I instead let them do everything they can and only look for things that match across different tools. Absolutely. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. A little bit louder. Sorry. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Volume and then that J3 cert from Salesforce is amazing, right? So that initial TLS handshake is not encrypted, and those cipher suites are unique per executable, right? So when we looked at the unique J3 cert or the J3 hashes that were in that environment, where those were actually associated with the DNS. It's actually DNS Cat 2's agent on that box, right? And it popped up as something that's not on every single machine, right? And so those correlate. So you didn't have to do any decryption at all to identify that, right? And if that matches also with some volume or some anomalous behavior when you're doing that population analysis, right? So like which box is being weird according to the other box in relevance to data bytes out and in, so we're still not doing decryption, then that starts to get you closer to being able to understand what's happening in those sessions. Yeah. Anybody else? Cool. Great. Thank you guys very much.